All right, everybody, welcome in. Today we are going on a little trip, virtually speaking, of course.
Where were we headed?
Buckle up. We're going to Vietnam,
Sounds fun. What part?
the Mekong Delta. Heard of it?
Oh, sure. Isn't that like the rice basket of Vietnam?
Exactly. It's this huge rice-producing region, or it has been. It's facing a pretty major challenge right now.
Oh, what's that?
Salinity intrusion. The delta's being slowly invaded by salt water.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a huge problem for rice farmers.
Yeah.
Saltwater and rice don't exactly get along.
Yeah.
So we're going to dive into how bad this salinity intrusion is and what those farmers are doing about it.
Exactly. And get this. We're digging into some really fascinating research papers that don't just look at the problem itself, but how men and women farmers are impacted differently.
Oh, interesting. I'm already curious to find out more. I mean, I get that it's a problem for everyone, but how do the challenges differ between men and women?
Well, first, let's get everyone on the same page about what salinity intrusion actually is.
Yeah, good point. So salinity intrusion, in the simplest terms, is basically what happens when salt water gets into areas where it's not supposed to be.
Right, and in the Mekong Delta, that's a big problem because this region is crisscrossed by all these rivers and canals, which are essential for rice farming. But with rising sea levels, the ocean water is pushing further inland, making the water saltier, and that's a death sentence for rice crops.
And we're not just talking about a few fields here and there. We're talking about a region that produces a ton of rice for Vietnam.
Yeah, it's a major source of food, not just for Vietnam, but for other parts of the world as well.
Exactly. And to put a finer point on it, about 80% of the people living in the Mekong Delta rely on rice farming for their livelihoods.
So this isn't some abstract environmental problem. It's hitting people right where it hurts the incomes, their food security, their way of life. So let's talk about these farmers. What can you tell us about them? Who are they?
Well, the research we're looking at today paints a pretty clear picture. The average farmer in these studies is about 52 years old. And get this, many of them inherited their farms.
Wow, so we're talking about families who've been farming this land for generations.
Generations, yeah. Which is kind of a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, you have all that experience, but on the other, it might be harder for them to adapt to such a dramatic change.
Totally, if it's always worked a certain way. And speaking of challenges adapting, the research also mentioned something about education levels, right?
Yeah, overall, education levels are pretty low, particularly among women. On average, they have less than a sixth grade education. Men are slightly higher, but still. And this is a critical point, because that lack of education can make it even harder to adapt to something as complex as climate change, especially when you layer on the fact that women in the Delta often have way less access to resources and information compared to men.
Wait, really? Even though they are facing the same crisis,
It's a huge problem.
Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. Think about training programs on how to adapt to salinity intrusion. You'd think everyone would be clamoring for that knowledge, right?
For sure. I mean, it's their livelihoods at stake.
Right. But the research found that only 36% of farmers overall had received any training. And for women, it's even worse. A shocking 77% of women hadn't attended any training, compared to 57% of men.
Wow. Why such a difference? I mean, I know you said women have less access in general, but what are the reasons behind it?
Well, some said they didn't have time, some said their husbands already went, and some simply didn't have access. It's like a whole system that often overlooks women's needs.
And it's not just training, right? You mentioned access to other resources too.
Exactly. Things like extension services, which provide crucial information and support, and formal institutions, like farmers' unions, which can be lifelines for networking and resources. Those are often out of reach for women, too.
So it's like they're facing this uphill battle against salinity intrusion, but they're being forced to fight with one hand tied behind their backs.
That's a good way to put it. And it really comes into sharp focus when we look the ways farmers are adapting to this salty invasion.
Well, don't leave us hanging. Spill the beans. How are they fighting back?
Oh, they are a resourceful bunch, let me tell you. Some are changing their planting calendars to try and avoid the worst of the salt water. Some are switching to more salt-tolerant varieties of rice.
Smart. Anything else?
Some are even getting really resourceful, collecting rainwater for daily use so they don't have to rely on the increasingly salty water sources.
Wow. Talk about making the best of a bad situation. But I have a feeling that it's not an even playing field when it comes to who's adopting these strategies. Am I right?
You are catching on quickly. The research found some striking differences in how men and women are adapting. And a lot of it comes down to those deep-rooted social structures we talked about earlier.
Like what?
Well, men, for instance, are far more likely to diversify their income.
What does that look like in this context?
So instead of putting all their eggs in the rice basket, so to speak, they might branch out into different crops that are more salt tolerant, or even start raising livestock.
Okay, that makes sense. So are you saying women aren't doing that as much?
Exactly. The research found 63% of men are diversifying their income compared to only 44% of women.
That's a massive difference. Why do you think that is?
Well, it likely boils down to control. Men often have more control over the land, more control over resources, more control over financial decisions. And to top it off, women often face greater obstacles when trying to get loans. And access to credit is crucial for any farmer who wants to make changes on their farm, especially big changes like switching crops.
So they're essentially trapped in a system that makes it harder to adapt. But there is a glimmer of hope, right? We talked about education playing a role here.
We did, and that's where those education levels we talked about earlier really come into play.
Right, because knowing more about the problem and about different adaptation strategies can really empower these women. Tell me more about what the research revealed.
Well, one of the things they found was that more educated women were more likely to try out a bunch of those different adaptation strategies we discussed.
That makes sense. Knowledge is power and all that. But it's not just about having the information, is it? It's also about confidence, right?
Yeah, totally. Education likely helps women feel more confident, like they can actually access resources and build those important support networks with other farmers. Plus, the research found that women who are already involved in those farmers' unions we talked about, those formal institutions, were more likely to diversify their crops and find other ways to make money. Being part of a group, sharing knowledge, supporting each other, it all makes a difference.
It's like a force multiplier. Okay, so we've established that salinity intrusion is a huge problem for these rice farmers, and that women are facing a whole other set of challenges on top of that. But this isn't just a story about rice yields and adaptation strategies. It gets to the heart of a much bigger issue: food security. Less rice means less income for these farmers, which means less food on the table. What can you tell us about that from the research?
Well, they dug into that connection pretty deeply and found that lower rice yields because of the salty water were directly linked to families having less money to spend on food.
Okay, so families are definitely being squeezed financially, but did the research get into what kinds of food people were cutting back on?
It did. And it wasn't just rice. Turns out they saw a pretty noticeable drop in how much meat and vegetables people were buying.
Yeah, that tracks. Meat and vegetables can be pricey. It makes sense that when budgets are tight, those are the first things to go.
Exactly. And that raises some important questions like, what happens if this problem keeps getting worse? We could be talking about serious long-term nutritional problems for these communities.
It's kind of heartbreaking when you think about it, especially when you consider that in many cultures, food, especially meals shared with family, are about so much more than just filling your stomach. It's about tradition, celebration, connection. So what happens to those traditions when families can't afford them anymore?
It's a really important point and something we don't always think about when we're focused on the economics of a situation.
Exactly. The human element is so important. Speaking of which, did the research tell us anything about how women, specifically, were handling this challenge of feeding their families on top of all the other limitations they're dealing with?
It did, actually. One of the things they noticed was that female-headed households tended to stockpile food more often when salinity intrusion was hitting their income hard.
Interesting. So a different approach, maybe not what you'd expect.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to create a buffer against those unpredictable swings in income, making sure there's always something to put on the table.
Resourceful. It really speaks to the resilience of these women, finding ways to provide for their families even when the odds are stacked against them.
For sure. Their resilience is incredible.
But how long can they keep that up?
Right. And that's really the question. While these short-term strategies are impressive, they aren't a permanent fix, which is why it's so important to tackle those root causes, the systemic inequalities that are making it harder for women to adapt and thrive in the face of this crisis.
We need to break that cycle. It sounds like empowering women by ensuring they have equal access to things like education, resources, and a say in the decisions that affect their lives is key to finding real, lasting solutions.
You got it.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems, but what about solutions? It seems like both of these papers we've been looking at agree on one thing. Women farmers need more support, and it needs to be the right kind of support. Let's ditch the theory and talk practical solutions. What can actually be done to help these women?
Well, one of the biggest things is expanding access to education and training, but with a focus on programs that are designed specifically for women.
Yeah, that makes sense, but what does that actually look like? We can't just take the same old programs and slap a women welcome sign on them, right?
Definitely not. It's about acknowledging the realities of these women's lives. So things like flexible scheduling that works around their other responsibilities, like childcare or taking care of the household.
Hmm.
Some might need help with transportation to even get there. These things might seem small, but they can make or break a woman's ability to participate.
It's about removing those barriers that someone who hasn't walked in their shoes might not even think about.
Exactly. And it's not just about logistics. The content of these programs needs to be tailored to their needs too. So things like financial literacy, business management skills, and of course, all the latest climate smart farming techniques.
So it's about giving them the tools not just to survive, but to really thrive, even with all the challenges they're facing.
Right. And remember those farmers unions we talked about. Those networks can be so important.
Yeah, like a lifeline, right? Helping them connect with each other and share resources.
Exactly. We need to make sure women feel welcome and supported in those spaces, maybe through mentorship programs, leadership training, or even just creating a more inclusive environment.
It's about breaking down those invisible barriers that tell women they don't belong or that their voices don't matter.
Absolutely. And then there's the financial side of things. The research was very clear that women need better access to credit and financial services.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference.
For sure. This could look like banks offering loans with more flexible terms, or even microfinance initiatives that are designed specifically for women.
So giving them the financial power to actually implement those new farming techniques and adapt to this changing environment.
Exactly. And this last one might seem obvious, but it's crucial. We need to make sure women's voices are being heard at every level of decision making.
So not just being talked about, but actually having a seat at the table when policies are being made.
Exactly. Local, regional, national, wherever decisions are being made about salinity intrusion, about climate change,
Yeah.
women need to be a part of that conversation.
Because at the end of the day, they're the ones living this reality every day. Their experience and their knowledge is so valuable, not just for their communities, but for everyone working to find solutions to these global challenges.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, everyone, we've covered a lot of ground today. We dug into the science behind salinity intrusion, talked about the very real human impact, especially for women farmers, and even explored some concrete solutions. It's a lot to process, but we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
And hopefully a little bit of hope, too.
For sure. What's happening in the Mekong Delta is a powerful reminder that climate change isn't some far-off problem. It's impacting people's lives right now all over the world. But it also shows us that the people most affected by these challenges, like those incredible women farmers we've been talking about, often hold the keys to creating a more resilient and equitable future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So what can you, our amazing listeners, do? Well, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. Keep learning about these issues, support the organizations doing such vital work on the ground, and most importantly, never underestimate the power of your own voice to make a difference. That's all we have time for on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.